The agri-world of Xylos was, by Imperial standards, unremarkable. Its skies were a perennial canvas of pale azure, its plains stretched verdant and fertile, yielding vast caloric surpluses that fed a dozen neighboring systems. Its cities, though modest, hummed with a quiet industry, driven by the rhythmic grind of hydroponic processors and the endless drone of atmospheric purifiers. Its planetary defense force, the Xylosian Guard, reflected the world itself, stoic, practical, and utterly conventional. They were drilled in the basic tenets of Imperial warfare, their laser guns well maintained, their flak armor serviceable, their loyalty unquestioning, if untested by any foe more formidable than the occasional feral beast or a band of disgruntled deep-mine cultists. Xylos was a bastion of quiet productivity, a humble cog in the vast grinding machine of the Imperium, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and ultimately unprepared for the terrible wrath of the warp. The storm did not arrive as a slow, ominous gathering of void clouds, nor did it manifest as a distant, flickering luminescence on the edge of the system. It burst forth with the sudden, violent rupture of reality itself. One moment, the Xylosian Guard's orbital defense stations reported clear the void lanes in routine shipping traffic. The next, a swirling vortex of emerald and amethyst, veined with crackling lightning and streaked with screaming faces, consumed the very stars. The Astronomicon, that distant, reassuring beacon, simply winked out, replaced by a screaming silence in the minds of the astropaths. Ships caught in its initial expansion were torn asunder, their hulls unraveling into impossible geometries, their crews devoured by unseen entities or driven mad by instant exposure to raw, unbridled chaos. Xylos itself, a world of life and light, became an island adrift in a sea of pure, unreasoning terror. Communications failed instantly. The planet's deep space augers screamed for a microsecond before their sensors melted, overwhelmed by psychic feedback. The sky, once a gentle blue, now pulsed with sickly greens and angry purples, casting the world in a perpetual twilight of maddening hues. On the ground, the immediate effects were devastating. The delicate balance of Xylos' ecosystems began to buckle under the strain. Flora withered, then mutated. Fauna, driven by primal fear and warp-infused aggression, turned savage, their forms distorting into grotesque parodies of their former selves. Rivers ran black, then shimmered with iridescent slicks. The very air grew thick with a metallic tang, laced with the scent of ozone and something indescribably foul, like decaying flesh and ozone. Within the cities, panic was instantaneous and absolute. Without the guiding light of the Emperor's Chosen, without the reassuring presence of the greater Imperium, the populace was adrift. The Xylosian Guard, for all their training, found themselves battling not just rioting citizens and encroaching mutated beasts, but also the insidious tendrils of despair and madness that seeped from the distorted reality above. Their chain of command, stretched thin and severed from all external oversight, struggled to maintain order. Commander Kalen Valerius, then a young captain, remembered the hollow sound of his voxcaster, crackling with static and disembodied whispers before falling utterly silent. That silence was louder than any roar of a demon, for it signified true, absolute isolation. For weeks, then months, the warp storm raged, a maelstrom of unreality that cocooned Xylos completely. The galaxy forgot the agri-world. To the greater Imperium, Xylos simply ceased to exist, swallowed by a rogue manifestation of the Imperium's wrath. Search efforts, brief and cursory, turned up nothing but shredded void matter and the lingering stench of the warp. Xylos was marked on star charts as lost to storm or presumed destroyed, but within that swirling nightmare, life on Xylos, against all odds, persisted. It clung to existence with a desperate, tenacious grip, but not without paying a terrible, irreversible price. The planet and its last vestiges of imperial humanity were irrevocably changed, set upon a path that would lead them far from what they once were and into the terrifying unknown. The seed of Xylos was lost, but it was not dead. It was merely beginning to germinate in the shadow of true horror. The initial months of the warp storm were a chronicle of unimaginable suffering and systemic collapse. The thin veneer of imperial order, always reliant on external support and the distant authority of Terra, crumbled swiftly. Without regular shipments of vital supplies, without the constant reassurance of the Emperor's light, the Xylosian populace descended into a desperate struggle for mere survival. Food ran scarce as crops withered or became tainted by warp energies. Livestock succumbed to grotesque mutations or the predation of newly spawned abominations. Water purifiers failed, their intricate mechanisms unable to cope with the bizarre contaminants that now infused the planet's hydrology. Disease born of deprivation and the raw virulence of the warp swept through the beleaguered population, claiming millions. But amidst this unraveling, something far stranger, far more insidious began to manifest. From the warped, nutrient-rich soil, from the stagnant pools of iridescent water, and even from the very air, a new form of life emerged. It was not of Xylos, nor was it easily categorized by Imperial xenobotanists or xenobiologists, had any been present to observe its terrifying genesis. It manifested first as a fine, almost invisible dust carried on the warp-tainted winds settling on every surface. Then it began to grow. Filamentous strands of a pale, phosphorescent fungal growth crept along decaying structures, forming intricate networks that glowed with an eerie internal light. Hardier, chitinous growths burst from the ground, mimicking the forms of plants but with an unnatural, predatory grace. What had once been the planet's indigenous flora and fauna were rapidly subsumed, overwritten, or entirely replaced by these alien invaders. These xenos organisms were not merely parasitic, they were deeply symbiotic and terrifyingly adaptive. They thrived on the warped energies that permeated Xylos, drawing sustenance from the altered environment, growing with unprecedented speed and vigor. They formed complex, interconnected ecosystems, a tapestry of fungal blooms, chitinous forests, and root-like tendrils that began to reclaim the ruins of human civilization. The air itself became thick with their spores, an invisible, constant rain that settled on flesh and fabric, on metal and stone. The Xylosian Guard, initially focused on maintaining order and combating the increasingly aggressive mutated beasts, soon found themselves facing a far more insidious enemy. Their equipment, meticulously maintained and religiously serviced, began to fail. Power cells for laser guns developed strange crystalline growths that drained their charge. Voxcasters sputtered and died as fine, fibrous strands infiltrated their internal mechanisms, forming conductive pathways of alien tissue. Flak armor, once a solid defense, became pitted and porous, its polymer weaves slowly dissolving as microscopic spores burrowed into the material, feeding and spreading rust. A conventional enemy was replaced by a more organic decay, a slow, methodical consumption by fungal tendrils. Commander Valerius, now promoted to the beleaguered interim governor of Xylos, watched with grim horror as his own uniform began to show the signs. A faint, earthy scent clung to his clothing, a faint luminescence emanated from the seams of his jacket, and when he scraped at his boots, a fine, pale powder drifted into the air. His engineers and biospecialists, those few who still lived and retained their sanity, worked frantically to understand and combat the spread, but their efforts were futile. The Xenos life forms were too pervasive, too adaptable. They defied all conventional understanding, absorbing and repurposing, transforming everything they touched. The true horror began when the spores and growths started to affect the humans themselves. At first it was subtle, persistent coughing, skin irritations, a faint metallic taste in the mouth. Then the symptoms grew more pronounced. Minor cuts and abrasions would not heal cleanly, instead forming hardened, chitinous scabs that slowly expanded. A network of glowing subdermal veins would appear, pulsing faintly beneath the skin, particularly around the eyes and along the limbs. The eyes themselves would sometimes develop an unnerving, iridescent sheen, reflecting light with an alien brilliance. Initially, the Xylosian Guard reacted with revulsion and fear. They burned those afflicted, believing it to be a plague, a demon-spawned corruption. They wore respirators until their filters clogged with spores and their oxygen ran out. They tried to sterilize entire hab blocks, only to find the growths returning with relentless speed. But as starvation gnawed at their bellies and the mutated landscape threatened to consume them, a terrible realization began to dawn. Those afflicted by the strange growths, while physically altered, seemed to be more resilient. Their wounds healed faster, often knitting together with a strange fibrous tissue. They could go longer without food or water, drawing sustenance from the symbiotic organisms within them. They developed an enhanced awareness of their surroundings, a subtle sensitivity to the fungal networks that now permeated the planet, almost as if they could feel the pulse of the warped biosphere. The Xenos' life, far from being purely destructive, was also offering a perverse form of salvation, a pathway to adaptation. This fungal embrace was a horrifying Faustian bargain. It granted resilience, but at the cost of purity, of humanity itself. Individuals began to display unnerving changes. Their voices grew deeper, more resonant, carrying an odd, clicking overtone. Their movements became subtly different, more deliberate, almost too fluid. The psychological toll was immense. Many simply succumbed to despair, allowing the growths to consume them, becoming little more than nutrient sacs for the burgeoning Xylos ecosystem, but others driven by a primal will to survive, or perhaps compelled by the silent, insidious influence of their new symbionts, began to accept the change. Commander Valerius witnessed his own soldiers, once paragons of imperial discipline, slowly transforming. A comms specialist had fine, root-like tendrils emerging from her scalp, weaving into the fibers of her helmet. A heavy weapons trooper found his flamer's fuel lines replaced by fleshy, bioluminescent tubes, the flame now issuing forth with an unholy green hue. Their armor, once dull metal, became a patchwork of chitinous plating and fibrous membranes, glowing with soft internal light. It was grotesque, blasphemous, but it worked. Their war gear, once failing, was now augmented, made stronger, more resistant to the warp's pervasive influence, integrated into their very beings. The Xylosian Guard, the last bastion of imperial authority on the lost world, was not merely adapting, it was evolving into something new, something alien. They were becoming, whether by choice or by dire necessity, the Spore-Kin, their very essence intertwined with the Xenos life that had consumed their world. They survived, but the humanity they preserved was no longer the humanity the Imperium knew. It was a new, terrifying breed, forged in the crucible of isolation and symbiotic horror, an unholy fusion of man and alien, awaiting the day they would once again touch the stars. The transformation of the Xylosian Guard into the Spore-Kin was not a sudden, violent metamorphosis, but a slow, insidious assimilation, a symphony of adaptation played out over decades of isolation within the warp storm. The initial horror and revulsion at the Xenos infestation gave way to a chilling, pragmatic acceptance, then a desperate reliance, and finally a profound, if blasphemous, integration. Survival was the ultimate arbiter, and the Xenos flora and fauna offered the only path forward. Commander Valerius, whose internal struggle raged silently, even as his outward form began to show subtle changes, presided over this terrifying evolution. He saw his soldiers, his people, twisting into something unrecognizable, yet undeniably resilient. Their skin, once soft and vulnerable, became toughened, almost leathery in places, shot through with the faint, glowing vascularity of the symbiotic organisms. Muscle mass increased, augmented by fibrous, chitinous implants that emerged from beneath the epidermis, lending them an unnerving strength. Their senses sharpened. They could detect the faintest tremors in the earth, the subtle shifts in air pressure, and the bioluminescent signatures of the pervasive fungal networks. They became part of Xylos, extensions of its new warped ecosystem. Their war gear, too, underwent a radical transformation. Traditional lasguns, once conventional and reliable, became living weapons. The stocks of the rifles were overgrown with dense, woody fibers, the power conduits replaced by pulsing, vascular tubes that drew sustenance directly from the wielder's biosystem. The weapon's core was often augmented with a bioluminescent sac that emitted an eerily stable laser beam, sometimes green or purple rather than the familiar red. Ammunition, when still available, was conserved. More often, the weapons discharged highly corrosive organic acids or solidified bursts of fungal spores, propelled by internal pneumatic sacs that functioned with disturbing efficiency. Each weapon became unique, tailored by the individual's symbiosis, a living extension of their will. Their armor, once standard-issue flak plate, was replaced by custom-grown chitinous plating. This organic armor, harvested from particularly hardy fungal forms or secreted directly from specialized symbiotic glands within the wearer's body, was lighter, stronger, and self-repairing. It fused seamlessly with their flesh, often forming grotesque but functional carapaces, adorned with bioluminescent patterns that shifted and pulsed with the wearer's heart rate. Respirators, once cumbersome, were discarded as their respiratory systems adapted to filter the spore-laden atmosphere, often developing gill-like structures along the neck or hardened, fibrous tracheas. Their helmets, now more akin to organic cranial extensions, often featured sensory tendrils that extended their peripheral vision and allowed them to feel the vibrations of their environment. Communication evolved beyond the failed voxcasters. The Xylosian Guard developed a complex system of bioluminescent signals, scent-based markers, and even low-frequency sonic clicks and hums, enabled by their heightened senses and altered vocal cords. They could communicate across vast distances through the interconnected fungal networks that now carpeted Xylos, a silent, unseen language that flowed beneath the ravaged surface of the world. This became their primary method of tactical coordination, a silent symphony of command and response that no conventional Imperium forces would ever decipher. Their fighting doctrine, too, was irrevocably shaped by this symbiosis. Conventional tactics of massed fire and disciplined lines gave way to a fluid, almost predatory form of warfare. They moved with unnatural stealth, camouflaged by their organic armor and their ability to blend seamlessly into the mutated landscape. They favored ambush, utilizing the planet's vast, interwoven fungal jungles and cavernous spore molds to stage devastating close-quarters assaults. Their enhanced strength and resilience made them formidable in melee, their custom-grown blades and blunt weapons capable of cleaving through even the hardiest of foes. They fought with a grim, silent efficiency, their movements a disturbing dance between human discipline and primal instinct. Discipline remained a testament to the Xylosian Guard's imperial legacy, but it was a discipline infused with alien pragmatism. They revered the Emperor, or at least the memory of his light, but their understanding of him had become warped, filtered through the lens of their unique existence. They saw the Xenos organisms not as an unholy abomination, but as a test, a crucible, a gift from the Emperor to ensure their survival. Their faith, though mutated, was unwavering in its conviction that they were still his servants, destined to endure. The decades passed. Generations of Xylosians were born into this new reality, never knowing a world untouched by the fungal embrace. They were stronger, faster, more resilient than their ancestors, perfectly adapted to their poisoned paradise. Their population dwindled, but those who remained were hardier, a selective breeding that favored the most integrated, the most symbiotic. Their minds, too, were subtly reshaped. Individuality gave way to a more communal consciousness, a silent, almost telepathic awareness of their comrades, facilitated by their shared biological substrate. They moved as one, fought as one, driven by the singular imperative of survival. Valerius, his form now a grotesque masterpiece of human and chitin, his voice a rasping whisper infused with a resonant hum, had become the living embodiment of their transformation. He was no longer just a commander. He was the spiritual nexus of the Spore-Kin, the oldest, most integrated of their number. He bore the weight of their deviation, the knowledge that they were no longer truly human in the eyes of the Imperium, yet he also carried the fierce pride of their survival. They had faced annihilation and had forged a new path, however blasphemous. They were ready. The universe might have forgotten Xylos, but Xylos had not forgotten the universe. They simply waited patiently for the return of the stars. The fighting doctrine of the Spore-Kin was not penned in dusty tomes of strategos or dictated from command decks, but etched into the very flesh and being of every Xylosian warrior. It was a fluid, adaptive philosophy, born of desperation and honed by a half-millennium of incessant struggle against the mutated horrors and predatory xenos that dominated their world. Their strategy was less about conventional warfare and more about a primal dance of predator and prey, perfected by their symbiosis with the living planet. At its core, their doctrine was one of absolute integration with their environment. They were not merely soldiers operating within a landscape, they were extensions of it. Every Xylosian warrior was a biological sensor array, capable of interpreting the subtle vibrations in the ground, the shifts in the spore-laden air currents, the faint bioluminescent pulses of the fungal networks, all relaying information with startling speed and precision. This collective awareness allowed them to move as a unified, silent entity, flowing through the ruins of their former cities, or the tangled, chitinous forests with unnatural grace. Stealth and ambush were their primary tools. Conventional Imperial forces relied on overwhelming firepower and fortified positions. The Spore-Kin, however, had learned that against ever-mutating, warp-tainted foes, direct confrontation was often suicidal. Instead, they would melt into the shadows, their organic armor shifting in hue and texture to mimic the surrounding fungal growths. They would lie motionless for hours, sometimes days, their bioluminescence damped, their breathing almost imperceptible, until their prey was within reach. Then, with sudden, terrifying coordination, they would erupt from the terrain, striking with devastating speed and ferocity. Their offensive operations were characterized by surgical strikes aimed at critical points rather than broad front engagements. A single squad of Spore-Kin might infiltrate a stronghold, using their organic tools to carve tunnels through solid rock or to dissolve barricades with corrosive secretions. Once inside, they would strike at the enemy's command structure, power conduits, or life support systems, crippling the foe before they could mount a coherent defense. Close quarters combat was their forte. Their enhanced strength, coupled with their unique organic weaponry, razor-sharp chitinous claws, bladed forearms, whips of hardened sinew, or short-range bioacid sprayers, made them terrifyingly effective in melee. Each warrior's symbionts would often produce specific combat augmentations, making every Spore-Kin a specialized terror. Defense was equally unconventional. Instead of static fortifications, they created living bulwarks. Miles of nutrient-rich fungal mycelia could be rapidly grown to form dense, resilient walls that absorbed kinetic energy and released clouds of stunning spores. Mutated fauna, partially controlled by specific Xylosian bioaugments, could be unleashed as guardians, their feral instincts guided by a subtle bioempathic link to the Spore-Kin. Their settlements, deep within the planet's hollowed-out subterranean caverns, were intricate mazes of living architecture designed to confuse and entrap any conventional invader. Leadership was diffuse, almost communal. While Commander Valerius remained the paramount authority, tactical decisions were often made in a decentralized manner, with squad leaders acting autonomously based on the real-time flow of biosensory data. Their enhanced collective awareness meant that orders could be conveyed not through shouted commands, but through subtle shifts in bioluminescence, low-frequency sonic pulses, or even a shared subconscious understanding facilitated by their interconnected symbionts. It was a terrifyingly efficient system, making them incredibly difficult to predict or disrupt. Their weaponry reflected their doctrine. Las guns, though still present, were often relegated to support roles. The primary tools of war were their integrated bioweapons, hardened bone blades that could be deployed from their forearms, bioacid spitters built into their gauntlets, or the terrifying spore launchers, organic growths on their shoulders or wrists that could propel noxious clouds, corrosive projectiles, or even debilitating fungal parasites onto their targets. Ammunition was never a concern, as the weapons drew their power and material directly from the warrior's symbiotic system. The fear of running dry was replaced by the constant, low-level drain on their own life force. Even their understanding of morality and sacrifice was altered. Individual loss was mourned, but understood as a necessary part of the cycle. A fallen warrior's body was never left behind. It was either consumed by their symbionts to recycle nutrients or meticulously carried back to communal biolabs to be integrated into new organic constructs or harvested for useful materials. Death was not an end, but a transformation, a return to the collective biomass that sustained them all. Their profound connection to the Xylos flora and fauna meant they could, in limited ways, manipulate the environment around them. They could accelerate the growth of defensive fungal barriers, summon bioluminescent guides through the dark, or even induce localized airborne spore events to sow confusion among their enemies. This ability made them masters of their warped world, turning its every hazard into a weapon. This doctrine, refined over centuries of isolation, had forged the Xylosian Guard into something far beyond the conventional planetary defense force they once were. They were no longer the simple guardians of a quiet agri-world. They were an alien-human hybrid fighting force, a force of nature as much as an army, a grim testament to the lengths humanity would go to survive, even if it meant sacrificing the very essence of what it meant to be human. They were ready for the return of the stars, ready to show the Imperium what 5 centuries of Grimdark adaptation had wrought. For 5 long centuries, Xylos existed as a cosmic ghost, a lost world consumed by the warp. Its name was a forgotten whisper, its coordinates erased from active imperial charts, marked only by faint historical records, as a tragic casualty of the unpredictable Imperium. The endless maelstrom of emerald and amethyst, of screaming souls and impossible colors that had enveloped the system had remained a constant, impenetrable barrier, a veil drawn across reality. Within its heart, The Spore-Kin of Xylos had carved out a brutal, symbiotic existence, fighting for every breath, every nutrient, every agonizing moment of continued life. They believed they were truly alone, the last remnants of humanity, abandoned by a galaxy that had forgotten them. Then, without warning, the veil began to fray. The first signs were subtle, perceptible only to the heightened senses of the Spore-Kin, a faint tremor, not of the planet's crust, but of the very fabric of reality. A fleeting glimpse of true starlight through the roiling tempest, a distant, unwavering pinprick of white that was undeniably the Astronomicon, a beacon they had long forgotten existed. For decades, Commander Valerius and the Elders had dismissed such sightings as warp-induced hallucinations, the lingering madness that afflicted so many. But as the tremors grew more frequent, the glimpses of true void more prolonged, a desperate hope began to flicker in the collective consciousness of the Spore-Kin. One standard Terran year later, the impossible happened. With a violent, protracted shriek that tore at the very soul, the warp storm that had consumed Xylos for 500 years began to unravel. It did not dissipate slowly. It imploded, collapsing inwards upon itself with the force of a cosmic supernova. Waves of raw psychic energy washed over the planet, causing momentary agony to the Spore-Kin, whose biosymbionts reacted violently to the unfiltered Imperium discharge. Mountains groaned, rivers evaporated, and the very air crackled with residual warp lightning. For days, Xylos was plunged into a dizzying vortex of reality-twisting chaos, a final convulsive gasp of the storm. When the dust settled, when the psychic echoes faded, the skies of Xylos were finally, gloriously clear. For the first time in 5 centuries, the true, cold void of space was visible. The constellations, ancient and familiar from forgotten history lessons, glittered with an indifferent brilliance. And then, a new star appeared. Not a natural star, but a slow-moving, intensely bright point of light. Then another, and another, until a small fleet of Imperial vessels, pristine and alien in their perfection, pierced the darkness. These were reconnaissance ships, dispatched by Battlefleet Baka, which had maintained a distant vigil over the sector, documenting the rogue storm. Their augurs, once useless against the warp storm's interference, now screamed with anomalous readings from a world believed long dead. Xylos, green-blue marble streaked with unnatural fungal growths and scarred by 5 centuries of unique evolution, was still there, and it was showing signs of life. The ships approached with extreme caution, their weapons charged, their shields raised. They had detected a faint, complex biosignature emanating from the planet's surface, unlike any known Xenos life but undeniably organized. They sent out standard Imperial hailing frequencies, broadcast declarations of intent, and demanded identification. On Xylos, the Spore-Kin watched. Their organic comm systems, long since adapted to the subtle frequencies of their own bio-networks, struggled to interpret the crude, brutal efficiency of Imperial Vox transmissions. Valerius, his form now a blend of ancient human and robust chitin, felt a surge of emotions he hadn't experienced in centuries, a flicker of hope, a pang of fear, and a deep, unsettling apprehension. He remembered stories of the Imperium, stories of its unyielding purity, its intolerance for deviation. He looked at his warriors, their bodies woven with alien life, their eyes glowing with an internal, unholy light. They were still human in their own twisted way, but would the Imperium recognize them as such? The decision was made with the same grim resolve that had defined their survival. They were children of the Emperor, however transformed. They would answer the call. Commander Valerius ordered a small, diplomatic party to surface, choosing those with the least overt mutations, those whose forms retained the most semblance of baseline humanity, even if that semblance was now a grotesque parody. He chose those who could still articulate, even if their voices were laced with clicks and hums, the ancient words of High Gothic. As the Imperial dropships descended, massive gray behemoths against the newly clear sky, the Spore-Kin prepared. They emerged from their hidden enclaves, their bioluminescence damped, their movements careful and deliberate. They carried their unique bioweapons, held at parade rest, a gesture of peace and readiness. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the descending craft, mingling with the earthy, fungal tang of Xylos. The rift in the Imperium had closed, but it had opened a far greater chasm, the gulf between what humanity once was and what it had been forced to become. The lost children of Xylos were about to confront their forgotten parents, and neither would be prepared for the encounter. The galaxy had found Xylos, but it was not the Xylos it remembered, nor were its inhabitants the humans it sought. The first Imperial landing force consisted of a heavily armed detachment of Battlefleet Baccha's security personnel, augmented by a contingent of Scutarii from a nearby forge world, their optical sensors glowing with cold, calculating scrutiny. Their Thunderhawk gunship, a hulking ceramite beast, descended slowly, its grav engines churning the spore-laden air into a vortex of debris and fungal dust. As its assault ramp lowered, a phalanx of power-armored figures emerged, their bolters and galvanic rifles held ready, their multispectral auspexes sweeping the unfamiliar terrain with nervous intensity. The air bristled with tension, a silent accusation hanging between two branches of humanity, separated by time, distance, and a profound, horrifying transformation. Commander Valerius, accompanied by a small honor guard of his most senior and least visibly altered Spore-Kin, stepped forward from the shadows of a bioluminescent fungal grove. He raised a hand in a gesture of peace, a gesture he hoped was still understood across the vast chasm of centuries. His own body was a testament to the fungal embrace. His skin, once pale, was now a mosaic of toughened dermis and subtle, organic plating. His eyes, though still human in shape, glowed with a faint internal amber light, and the subtle clicks and hums that accompanied his high Gothic were unnerving. His uniform, woven from resilient organic fibers and chitin, pulsed with a dim phosphorescent glow. His honor guard, equally transformed, stood silent and still, their bioweapons held loosely but ready, their forms a disturbing blend of man and alien. The Imperial captain, a stern-faced woman named Thule, clad in the stark black of Battlefleet Command, visibly recoiled. Her comms crackled with hushed, urgent whispers. The Scutarii, their metallic forms unreadable, seemed to lock onto the Xylosians with a predatory intensity, their weapons shifting minutely. The sheer alienness of the Spore-Kin was a visceral shock. They were humanoid, undeniably, but the pervasive fungal growths, the chitinous armor, the glowing eyes, the subtly inhuman proportions. It was a vision of heresy made flesh. Valerius began to speak, his voice raspy but resonant. "We are the Xylosian Guard. We are loyal servants of the Emperor, and we welcome you to our world, the world we have preserved through his grace." Each word, though ancient and familiar, sounded utterly alien coming from his transformed throat, laced with the strange clicks and a deep guttural hum that vibrated through the ground. Captain Thule's reaction was immediate and unambiguous. "Identify yourselves, abominations. You are no Imperial Guard I have ever seen. Declare your allegiance, or prepare to be purged." Her bolter, already aimed at Valerius's chest, gave a subtle hum of activation. The Scutarii behind her advanced a half step, galvanic crackles dancing across their weapon barrels. Valerius paused, a flicker of ancient sorrow in his amber eyes. "We are the sons and daughters of Xylos, Captain. We have endured 5 centuries within the warp storm. We have fought to survive, to keep the Emperor's light burning on this world, however dimly. Our forms may be changed, but our loyalty remains." He gestured to the ravaged, yet undeniably thriving fungal chitin landscape around them. "This is our testament to survival. This is what we became." The captain's face hardened, disgust warring with disbelief. The concept of a world surviving such a prolonged warp storm was unheard of, a logistical and theological impossibility. But the evidence stood before her, grotesque and undeniable. "Your forms are anathema. Your words are lies. No loyal servant of the Emperor could bear such corruption. What unholy pacts have you made? What xenos filth has defiled your flesh?" Before Valerius could respond, a sudden sharp crackle erupted from a Scutari's voxcaster. "Bio-readings anomalous. Non-human genome detected. Pervasive symbiotic relationship with undocumented xenos flora and fauna. Threat level. Exterminatus protocols potentially applicable." The dry, synthesized voice of the tech priest sent a shiver down the spines of even the hardened Imperial Guardsmen. Valerius felt a surge of cold despair. They would not understand. They could not. "We made no pacts, Captain. We adapted. We survived. The Emperor demands perseverance, does he not? We did what was necessary to preserve his realm here." Captain Thule, however, saw only blasphemy. The unholy fusion of man and alien was the ultimate heresy, a direct violation of the Emperor's sacred decree against the Xenos. She had seen cultists and mutants, but never anything quite like this. The Xylosians were too organized, too coherent, too disturbingly human in their underlying structure, yet utterly alien in their manifestation. They were a living paradox, a walking affront to the very principles of the Imperium. You speak of loyalty, yet you are defiled. You speak of preservation, yet you are twisted beyond recognition, Captain Thule declared, her voice ringing with grim conviction. By the authority of the Emperor and Battlefleet Baka, I declare you Xenos-tainted aberrations. Lay down your instruments and submit to purification. Any resistance will be met with overwhelming force. Valerius looked around at his honor guard, at the silent, grim faces of his Spore-Kin warriors. He saw their inner conflict, their desperate desire to reconnect with the Imperium, but also their fierce pride in what they had become, in their survival. They had not come this far to be purged as if they were mere beasts. They had survived the warp, they had survived their world's madness, and they would not simply surrender their unique existence. A subtle collective hum vibrated through the ground from the Xylosian ranks. It was not a challenge, but a statement. We survived, Valerius stated, his voice now devoid of any hope, imbued only with grim resolve. We will not be purged. The first gaze of horror had been met. It was followed by a chilling certainty. The Imperium would not embrace its lost children. It would only seek to destroy them. The cold reality of their reintegration had begun, not with a welcome, but with the stark, unyielding condemnation of a galaxy that had forgotten them, and could not now understand them. The standoff on the surface of Xylos shattered instantly, erupting into a maelstrom of violence that neither side truly desired, but both were irrevocably drawn into. Captain Thule, her patience exhausted, and her abhorrence of the Xylosians' transformed state overriding any further diplomatic overtures, barked the order to fire. Bolters roared, spitting explosive rounds that tore through the spore-laden air. Galvanic rifles whined, unleashing arcs of lethal energy. The Spore-Kin, anticipating the betrayal, reacted with a chilling preternatural speed. Their organic armor, though grotesque, proved surprisingly resilient. The first volleys of bolter fire, designed to shred ceramite, merely chipped and gouged the fused chitin and hardened fibers of their carapaces. Some rounds detonated against the thick, fibrous plates, scattering segments of organic material, but inflicting only superficial wounds. The Xylosians, moving with a disturbing fluidity, melted back into the dense fungal growths that surrounded the landing zone. Valerius, his form a whirlwind of motion, parried a Scutari's bayonet lunge with a chitin-reinforced forearm, the metallic clang echoing unnaturally. He responded with a swift, brutal strike, his free hand deploying a bioacid spur that splattered corrosive ichor onto the Scutari's chest plate, causing synth flesh and wiring to fizzle in smoke. His honor guard engaged with a silent, deadly precision, their integrated bioweapons proving horrifically effective. One warrior, adorned with a crest of hardened bone, head-butted an Imperial Guardsman, shattering his helmet and sending him sprawling. Another launched a volley of needle-like spores from her wrist-mounted organs, sending several Scutari into spasming fits as their nervous systems overloaded. The Imperial forces, for all their superior firepower and training, were utterly unprepared for the nature of their foe. The Xylosians were not conventional rebels, nor were they the mindless Xenos hordes they often encountered. They fought with a grim, disciplined intelligence, their movements coordinated with an eerie, collective prescience. They moved through the fungal groves with the ease of predators, using the dense bioluminescent flora as cover and concealment, appearing and disappearing with unnerving speed. Captain Thule, though horrified, quickly adapted. She ordered her forces to consolidate, forming a tight perimeter around the Thunderhawk, pouring suppressing fire into the fungal growths. The sheer volume of bolter rounds and galvanic energy began to take its toll. Organic plating shredded, bone blades shattered, and some Xylosians fell, their forms twitching as the Emperor's fury tore through their symbiotic biology. The air became thick with the smell of ozone, burnt flesh, and the strange, earthy tang of ruptured fungal tissue. The skirmish was short, brutal, and utterly without mercy. The Xylosian honor guard, though fighting with desperate ferocity, were ultimately outgunned. Valerius, witnessing the mounting casualties, made the agonizing decision to withdraw. He let out a piercing, low-frequency hum, a command understood instantly by his Spore-Kin. They disengaged, melting back into the shadows and the depths of Xylos' altered ecosystem, leaving behind a handful of fallen comrades and a terrified, bewildered Imperial detachment. The Thunderhawk quickly extracted the Imperial forces, returning to orbit with their mangled dead and a collection of Xylosian biosamples. Captain Thul's report to Battlefleet Baka was stark. The lost world of Xylos was infested by a Xenos-human hybrid, a new form of abomination that defied all Imperial understanding. They were tenacious, resilient, and utterly defiled. In orbit, the information was immediately relayed to the Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus. The response was swift and merciless. An Inquisitor Lord, a grim figure named Vorlag, was dispatched with a detachment of his own stormtroopers and a cadre of tech priests dedicated to xenocidal research. For the Xylosians, the short, bloody exchange on the planet's surface was just the beginning. Back on Xylos, Valerius regrouped his forces. The cost of their failed diplomatic overture was felt deeply. The dead, few though they were honored. Their bodies were carefully brought back to the deepest biochambers, where their organic components would be recycled into the larger, living networks of Xylos, their consciousness perhaps contributing to the planet's silent hum. The reality was laid bare. The Imperium did not recognize them. It saw only abomination, heresy, and Xenos taint. There would be no reintegration, no understanding, only condemnation and eventual extermination. Valerius felt the weight of 5 centuries of lonely survival press down upon him. He had sought to save his people, to bring them back into the fold, but the fold was too rigid, too unforgiving. The interrogation and condemnation began not with words, but with fire. From orbit, the Imperial fleet began a systematic orbital bombardment of suspected Xylosian settlements. It was not an exterminatus, not yet, but a sustained campaign of cleansing fire, meant to soften up the planet for ground assault. Promethium bombs rained down, igniting vast swaths of fungal forests. Plasma torpedoes carved craters into the landscape, boiling away the iridescent rivers. The sky, once clear, was again choked with smoke and the orange glow of burning organic matter. But the Spore-Kin were children of their world. They had adapted to the constant threat of mutation and environmental destruction. Their settlements were often subterranean, deep within the planet's crust, shielded by layers of living rock and specialized fungal growths designed to absorb thermal and kinetic energy. They scattered, retreated into the deep, enduring the hammer blows from above, their resolve hardening with every fiery impact. Valerius, watching the distant firestorms from his underground command center, understood the grim calculus. The Imperium would not stop. They would burn Xylos to ash, or they would burn until every last Spore-Kin was purged. He had bought his people 5 centuries of existence, but the bill had finally come due. The Imperium, relentless and unyielding, was here to collect. Their existence was an affront, their survival a heresy. The time for talking was over. The time for fighting had truly begun. Deep within the living, subterranean caverns of Xylos, shielded from the cleansing fires of the Imperium, Commander Valerius communed with his elders. These were the oldest of the Spore-Kin, those who had endured the longest, their forms the most integrated with the planet's unique biology, their consciousnesses a profound, almost collective repository of Xylos's grim history. In the faint, phosphorescent glow of the fungal chamber, their voices, a symphony of clicks, hums, and guttural whispers, recounted the ancient truths. "They have forgotten," rasped Elder Mycelia, her body a gnarled mass of chitin and pulsing fungal sacs, her eyes glowing like twin embers. "They remember only the dogma, not the struggle, not the promise of the Emperor's light enduring against all odds." Valerius felt the truth of her words in his very bones. He remembered the catechisms of his youth, the prayers to the God Emperor, the unwavering belief in his divine benevolence and guiding hand. He had taught his own soldiers those same words, however altered their understanding became. Yet the Imperium that had returned was a cold, unyielding monolith, incapable of seeing past the surface, unable to comprehend the desperate adaptation that had preserved a fragment of humanity. For centuries, the Spore-Kin had held fast to the fractured tenets of the Imperial Creed. They believed the Emperor had willed their survival, had perhaps even guided the Xenos symbionts to them as a means to endure the impossible warp storm. Their faith had twisted, certainly, becoming a unique syncretic blend of imperial reverence and animistic veneration for their living world, which they saw as a manifestation of the Emperor's enduring will. They still whispered his name in times of battle, still offered silent thanks for their continued existence. They were, in their own minds, his most resilient, most adaptive children. But now the Imperium had called them abomination. "They call us Xenos," another elder, known only as Root, whispered, his voice a deep resonant rumble that shook the fungal stalactites. "They deny the human spark within us, the spirit that cried for survival. They would see us cleansed, wiped from the stars for daring to live differently." Valerius knew this was the central, agonizing truth of their situation. The Imperium's hatred of the Xenos was absolute, immutable. Its fear of mutation, its abhorrence of divergence, was a foundational pillar of its existence. The Spore-Kin were the ultimate violation of these tenets. They were mutants, to be sure, but more terrifyingly, they were human-xenos hybrids, a biological heresy that threatened the very definition of humanity in the Imperium's eyes. He stood silent for a long moment, the pulsing bioluminescence casting shifting shadows across his transformed features. He reached out with his heightened senses, feeling the thrum of the living planet, the distant tremor of imperial bombardments. He felt the fear and uncertainty of his people, but also their quiet, simmering defiance. "Our faith is our shield," Valerius finally declared, his voice cutting through the whispers of the elders, infused with a new grim resolve. "Our survival is his testament. We sought to return, to offer our strength, but they have chosen ignorance. They have chosen war." He then recounted the events of the brief encounter with Captain Thule, the swift condemnation, the immediate declaration of war. He spoke of the fear and revulsion in the Imperial captain's eyes, the cold, calculating analysis of the Scutarii. He did not embellish, he did not soften the blow. The Imperium had not recognized them. It had judged them. A profound silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the living rock. The elders, ancient and wise in their grotesque forms, understood the gravity of the declaration. "We have kept the flame," Elder Mycelia said, her voice softer now, almost mournful. "We have endured, and for that, they wish to snuff us out." "Then we will show them the strength of that flame," Valerius responded, his amber eyes hardening. "We will show them what 5 centuries of survival can forge. We will show them that the Emperor's will for perseverance is stronger than their fear of what they do not understand." The echoes of faith, once a source of comfort and a longing for reconnection, now became a clarion call for defiance. The Spore-Kin had believed themselves loyal, had clung to the fractured memory of their origins. But the Imperium's outright rejection had severed that final, fragile thread. They were no longer seeking acceptance. They were fighting for the right to exist. They were fighting for the sanctity of their survival. Valerius began to issue orders, his voice firm and unwavering. Defensive preparations were to be intensified. Scouting parties were to monitor Imperial movements. Bioweapon production was to be accelerated. The Xylosian Guard, the Spore-Kin, were to be readied for a war of attrition, a desperate defense against an enemy that saw them as less than human. Their faith, once directed outwards to a distant abstract emperor, now turned inwards, solidifying around their shared existence, their unique bond with Xylos, and their collective will to endure. The emperor, they reasoned, would surely favor those who clung to life against impossible odds, those who found a way where there was no way. If the Imperium of man could not comprehend this truth, then they would show it in battle. The echoes of faith had become the drums of war. The orbital bombardment continued for weeks, a relentless fury from above that scoured the surface of Xylos. The Imperium, unwilling to risk valuable ground troops against an unknown and potentially infectious foe, opted for a preliminary cleansing. Promethium napalm turned vast fungal forests into lakes of fire. Plasma lances vaporized exposed fortifications, and kinetic munitions carved immense craters into the planet's flesh. From orbit, Xylos was a tortured landscape of flame and ash, a testament to the Imperium's unforgiving wrath. But the Spore-Kin, having lived for centuries in the constant shadow of environmental catastrophe and against predatory mutated life, were masters of resilience. Their subterranean cities, built into the planet's natural geological formations and reinforced by layers of self-repairing organic matter, proved surprisingly resistant. Deep-rooted fungal networks absorbed seismic shockwaves, and specialized bioluminescent flora filtered the toxic airborne debris. They retreated into the planet's embrace, allowing the firestorm to wash over their surface, biding their time. Inquisitor Lord Vorlag, a gaunt, severe man whose zeal burned hotter than any plasma bolt, oversaw the orbital campaign from the bridge of his battlecruiser, the Divine Scourge. He received constant, disheartening reports from his tech priests. The planet's ecosystem, though undeniably xenos-tainted, was too robust, too intertwined to be easily sterilized. The biosignatures of the Spore-Kin persisted deep beneath the surface, stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. "Send in the probes," Vorlag commanded, his voice a low growl. "Deploy the Skitarii legions. We will burn them out, root and branch if necessary." The first ground assault was a terrifying symphony of Imperial might. Waves of heavily armed Skitarii, their metallic forms gleaming under the pallid, smoky sky, descended in vast dropships. They were accompanied by Castellan robots, their heavy bolters spitting death, and a company of Battlefleet Baka's well-drilled Imperial Guard, clad in gas masks and void-sealed armor. Their mission, to secure designated landing zones, establish fortified positions, and begin the systematic purging of the Xylosian threat. The Spore-Kin met them not with conventional lines of defense, but with the full, terrifying ingenuity of their altered world. The Imperials landed in what appeared to be barren, ash-strewn plains, only for the ground to erupt. Hidden fungal spores, agitated by the Skitarii's grav boots, exploded into noxious clouds that choked respirators and corroded exposed armor. The ash itself was often a fine layer over rapidly grown, chitinous spikes that impaled unwary troopers. From concealed tunnels and groves of resistant, bioluminescent flora, the Spore-Kin emerged. They struck with their signature precision and ferocity, their organic armor allowing them to move silently and swiftly through the hazardous terrain. A Castellan robot, its heavy bolter tearing through a grove, was suddenly swarmed by a dozen Spore-Kin. Their bioacid sprays sizzled against its ceramite plating, while others leapt onto its back, using integrated organic tools to pry open power conduits, bypassing its auto defenses. The robot, once an unstoppable engine of destruction, shuddered and fell, its internal systems melting into slag. The Imperial Guard, accustomed to facing human foes or predictable xenos, found themselves utterly outmatched in this alien environment. The Xylosians were masters of ambush. They used their bioluminescence to lure Imperial patrols into deadly traps, then extinguished their internal lights, melting into the shadows before striking. They deployed mutated fauna, grotesque creatures of chitin and muscle, partially controlled by specific Xylosian bioaugments, to harass and delay the Imperial advance. These creatures, ranging from multi-legged behemoths that charged fortifications to swarms of flying spore bats that carried debilitating toxins, added to the chaos and terror. The Skitarii, with their advanced auspexes and cybernetic enhancements, fared better, but even they struggled. Their sensors, designed to detect mechanical signatures and known bioforms, were often overwhelmed by the sheer, complex organic noise of Xylos, or jammed by directed bioemissions from the Spore-Kin. The Xylosians, too, had learned to exploit the weaknesses of their technology, focusing their attacks on vulnerable sensor arrays or exposed power conduits. In one particularly brutal engagement, a company of Imperial Guard found themselves encircled in a deep chasm. The walls, seemingly smooth rock, suddenly sprouted razor-sharp chitinous tendrils that snared and impaled troopers. From the darkness above, Spore-Kin warriors launched themselves, their forms a blur of motion, landing amidst the Imperials with devastating force. Their organic blades carved through flak armor, their bioacid sprays turned flesh to pulp. It was a slaughter, a testament to the Xylosians' mastery of their transformed world. Commander Valerius, leading from the front, as always, felt a grim satisfaction amidst the horror of war. He saw the efficiency of his warriors, their seamless integration with the planet, their collective will to survive. He knew this was not sustainable in the long term. The Imperium's resources were infinite compared to their own. But they were buying time. They were proving their worth, their strength, their right to exist. As the first few Imperial outposts were shattered, their garrisons massacred, Inquisitor Vorlog's fury grew. His initial assessment of a simple localized infection was proven tragically wrong. Xylos was a living weapon, and its inhabitants were its most lethal components. The Spore-Kin were not just survivors. They were a formidable, uniquely adapted fighting force. The battle for Xylos had begun, not as a swift purge, but as a grueling, terrifying trial of steel. And Spore, where the ancient dogmas of the Imperium clashed with the terrifying ingenuity of a desperate, alienated humanity. The initial Imperial ground assault faltered, then stalled, bogged down by the alien tactics of the Spore-Kin and the treacherous, self-aware ecosystem of Xylos. The Inquisitor Lord Vorlog seethed with cold fury. The cost in Scitarii and Imperial Guard lives was unacceptable, a testament to the abominable efficacy of the Xenos-tainted natives. He called for a shift in strategy, realizing that conventional Imperial might, while eventually overwhelming, would be too costly against such an integrated foe. The Imperium escalated its efforts, deploying specialized units designed for environmental warfare and Xenos extermination. Kasrkin stormtroopers clad in void-sealed carapace armor and wielding hotshot laser guns were deployed to spearhead probing attacks, their training making them marginally more resilient to the Xylosian environment. Units of the Adeptus Mechanicus' Secutarii, with their more esoteric weaponry and cybernetic resilience, were tasked with mapping the complex fungal networks and attempting to sever the Xylosians' environmental advantages. Even a detachment of Deathwatch kill teams, clad in their gleaming black power armor, was requested, their expertise in xenocidal warfare deemed essential. These elite forces, however, also found themselves struggling. The Kasrkin, though disciplined, were still susceptible to the debilitating spores and corrosive biotoxins that permeated Xylos. Their advanced auspexes, while superior to those of the Scitarii, still struggled with the sheer biological noise of the planet. The Secutarii, with their arc rifles and Volkite weaponry, inflicted terrible damage, but the Xylosian biostructures displayed an uncanny ability to self-repair, drawing nutrients directly from the underlying mycelial networks. The Deathwatch, few in number but peerless in skill, proved to be the most formidable of the Imperial response. Their targeted strikes into key Xylosian nodes inflicted heavy casualties, forcing the Spore-Kin to adapt rapidly. Their power armor was resistant to many of the bioweapons, and their bolters tore through chitinous plating with terrifying efficiency. Yet, even the Deathwatch found themselves fighting a constant, exhausting battle of attrition, their every victory hard-won against an enemy that seemed to flow from the very ground itself. For the Spore-Kin, these were desperate times. Each engagement, though often resulting in heavy Imperial casualties, came at a terrible cost to their own dwindling numbers. Their population, already thinned by centuries of isolation, could not sustain such losses. Valerius watched his warriors fall, their unique organic forms collapsing, their bioluminescence fading as their life force ebbed away. Each loss was a profound wound to the collective, a part of their living world's consciousness extinguished. One particularly devastating Imperial assault targeted a major Xylosian bioproduction facility, a vast pulsating cavern deep beneath the surface where new organic armor and bioweapons were cultivated. The Deathwatch, guided by Imperial Guard infiltrators, punched through the outer defenses, their bolters carving a bloody swath through the Spore-Kin defenders. Commander Valerius himself led the counterattack, his body a blur of chitin and muscle, his integrated weapons spraying searing bioacid and razor-sharp shrapnel. The battle raged for hours in the bioluminescent gloom, a horrific spectacle of clashing steel and organic fury. Valerius fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast, his millennia-spanning resolve hardening with every Imperial life he took, every Xylosian life he sought to protect. He engaged a Deathwatch veteran sergeant in a brutal duel, their weapons blurring, power armor against living chitin, bolter fire against bioacid. The veteran sergeant was a master of close combat, his chains are a snarling maw of adamantium teeth, but Valerius's raw, symbiotic strength and unnatural agility made him a formidable opponent. The duel ended in a sickening crunch, Valerius's integrated bone blade piercing the ceramite plates of the veteran sergeant's chest, silencing the chain Zord. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The bioproduction facility was heavily damaged, its intricate networks of fungal growth and organic vats ravaged by Imperial demolitions. The ability of the Spore-Kin to replenish their unique war gear had been severely curtailed. Many of their most integrated engineers and biospecialists were lost in the fight, their knowledge irreplaceable. The Spore-Kin had won the battle, driving the Imperials back from the ruined facility, but the cost was immense. Their population was further depleted, their essential infrastructure crippled, and the morale of some warriors began to waver. They were defending their world, yes, but the relentless pressure of the Imperium was grinding them down, slowly but surely. Valerius returned to his command cavern, his body aching, his mind heavy with grief and a growing sense of desperation. He looked at the holographic maps depicting the scorched surface, the slow, methodical advance of Imperial forces. Their victories were momentary reprieves, their resistance a delaying action. The Imperium's might was inexorable, its will to purge unwavering. The Spore-Kin had fought with unparalleled bravery and tactical genius, adapting their world into a weapon, yet they were paying a terrible price. Every enemy trooper slain was replaced by 2 more. Every damaged Imperial vehicle was eventually recovered and repaired. But every lost Xylosian was an irreplaceable part of their dwindling species, a thread severed from their collective consciousness. The cost of victory was slowly becoming the harbinger of their ultimate defeat, a grim calculus of attrition that threatened to erase Xylos from existence once and for all. Commander Valerius, known as the Root Commander among his people, bore the crushing weight of Xylos' survival. He was more than just a military leader. He was the living memory of a lost past, the unwavering will of his transformed people, and the physical nexus of their symbiotic existence. His form, a masterpiece of natural adaptation and horrifying integration, was a testament to the centuries of struggle. His skin was a dense, interlocking pattern of chitinous plates and fibrous muscle. His eyes glowed with the deep, amber light of a bioluminescent fungus, and his voice, when he chose to speak in High Gothic, was a resonant, multitonal hum that carried the weight of ancient sorrow. His personal journey mirrored that of Xylos itself, a slow, agonizing drift from conventional humanity into something entirely new, forged in the crucible of isolation. He had been a young, idealistic captain when the warp storm descended, clutching to the purity of the Imperial creed. Now his devotion was to his people, to the twisted, undeniable life that Xylos had become. He remembered the taste of untouched water, the feel of unaugmented flesh, the distant comfort of the Astronomicon. These memories were dim, like fading echoes in a cavern, but they were there, a constant reminder of what they had lost and what they fought to preserve. The burden of command was immense. He watched his warriors, born into this warped existence, fight with a savage grace that would have appalled his younger self. He saw the resilience in their glowing eyes, the unwavering loyalty in their unified movements, and knew that their fate, their very right to exist, rested on his shoulders. Each tactical decision, each desperate counterattack, each retreat into the planet's deeper embrace was a way against the annihilation of his people. He felt the planet's pain as the orbital bombardment continued, a dull ache that resonated through his integrated symbionts. He felt the fear of his warriors, their unique bioempathic connection allowing him to sense their collective unease, their desperate longing for an end to the ceaseless war. Yet he also felt their determination, their willingness to fight to the last, their unyielding belief in their own survival. One night, deep within the primary command cavern, as the distant rumble of Imperial ordnance echoed through the living rock, Valerius sat in quiet contemplation. Elder Mycelia, her ancient form radiating a soft, calming light, approached him. "The burdens you carry, Root Commander," she rasped, her voice a complex series of clicks and soft hums that Valerius understood intimately. "They are heavier than the rock above us." "They are the weight of Xylos," Valerius replied, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "The weight of a promise made to those who came before and to those who will follow, a promise that we would not simply vanish." "The Imperium sees only death for us," Mycelia continued, her glowing eyes fixed on him. "They will not relent. Even if we bleed them dry, they will send more. Their dogma is a blindfold to our truth." "Then we must show them a truth they cannot deny," Valerius stated, his amber eyes narrowing. "A truth forged in battle, a truth that speaks of our right to exist, even if it is a terrifying right." Mycelia nodded slowly, her ancient chitinous head dipping. There are whispers, Root Commander, whispers of a path, a desperate measure, a forgotten relic that might turn the tide, or consume us all. Valerius turned, his attention suddenly focused. Speak of it, Elder. What whispers? In the deep places where the oldest growths reside, there is a legend, Mycelia began, her voice dropping to a lower frequency. A legend of the heart of Xylos, an ancient artifact, not of our making, nor of the Imperium's. It predates the warp storm, perhaps even predates human settlement. It is said to be a nexus of primal bioenergy, a relic of immense power that feeds the very life force of this world. Some believe it is what kept Xylos from being utterly consumed by the warp storm, nurturing the strange life that saved us. Valerius had heard the folk tales, the campfire stories of the deep miners from before the warp storm, fanciful legends of glowing crystals and primordial energies. He had dismissed them as superstitions. But now, in this desperate hour, the words held a new, chilling significance. Its power? Valerius questioned, his mind racing. How could it aid us? It is said to amplify, Mycelia explained, to accelerate growth, to strengthen life, to intertwine what is disparate, but also to consume, to unleash uncontrolled expansion, to warp beyond recognition. It is a tool of creation and destruction, a force beyond our complete understanding. Valerius gazed at the pulsing bioluminescent fungi that adorned the cavern walls, then at the forms of his devoted warriors. He thought of the relentless Imperial onslaught, the dwindling numbers of his people, the impossibility of conventional victory, a desperate measure, a powerful relic, a glimmer of hope, or a final, self-inflicted doom. The burden of Xylos now included a terrifying new weight, the decision to seek out and potentially unleash a force of unknown power, a relic that could either save his people or twist them into something even more alien, condemning them in the eyes of the universe forever. But the alternative was certain annihilation. Valerius, the Root Commander, bore the burden of this horrifying choice, the ultimate gamble for the survival of the Spore-Kin. His resolve solidified. He would seek out this heart of Xylos, for there was no other path left to them. The Imperial ground invasion escalated in ferocity, a relentless hammer blow against the deep-rooted resilience of Xylos. Inquisitor Lord Vorlag, spurred by his abhorrence of the Spore-Kin's very existence, ordered the deployment of increasingly destructive weaponry. Thermobaric bombs turned subterranean caverns into infernos, seismic charges collapsed vast swathes of living rock, and chemical agents designed to sterilize even the most virulent xenos were unleashed in targeted zones. The surface of Xylos became a desolate wasteland, choked with ash and burning gas, but still the biosignatures of the Spore-Kin stubbornly persisted. Deep within the planet, guided by the ancient lore of the Elders and the subtle bioempathic signals of the deepest fungal networks, Commander Valerius led a hand-picked expedition. Their objective? The heart of Xylos, a mythical nexus of bioenergy, hidden in the primordial depths of their world, a place untouched even by the initial warp storm. The journey was perilous, through unmapped tunnels, past ancient geological formations that glowed with strange, internal light, and through regions of the planet's core that pulsed with an almost conscious energy. Imperial forces, meanwhile, pressed their advantage. A major thrust, spearheaded by a detachment of Space Marine scouts and supported by heavy armor, focused on a suspected primary Xylosian bionexus, a vast subterranean cavern that pulsed with more intense biosignatures than any other. This was, unknown to the Imperials, a vital Xylosian communal chamber, a central hub for their symbiotic networks, and a sanctuary for the remaining non-combatant population, including the youngest Spore-Kin. Valerius received the warning through the collective consciousness of his people, a sudden frantic surge of fear and alarm that resonated through his own symbionts. The Imperial forces were too close, their advance too swift. He was still days from the heart of Xylos, yet his people faced imminent slaughter. He faced a terrible choice: continue his desperate quest for the relic, risking the immediate annihilation of his people, or turn back and face the Imperial juggernaut with his dwindling forces. His decision was immediate, driven by the fierce love for his people that transcended his transformation. "The heart of Xylos can wait," he rasped, his voice a guttural command. "My people cannot. We move to intercept. All available units converge on the communal chamber. We will hold the line." He rerouted his expedition, doubling back through the twisting organic tunnels, moving with a speed and agility that astonished even his own hardened warriors. The very ground seemed to assist them, the fungal networks pulsing with guiding light, the air currents shifting to aid their passage. They arrived at the communal chamber just as the Space Marine scouts, their bolters spitting death, breached the final defensive barrier, a wall of rapidly grown phosphorescent chitin that shimmered with ethereal energy. Behind them, the rumble of land raiders and predators announced the impending arrival of heavy Imperial armor. The Spore-Kin defenders, already depleted and outnumbered, fought with the ferocity of desperate parents protecting their young. Their bioweapons hissed and spat, their organic armor shrugging off last fire. But the Space Marine scouts were implacable, their skill and resilience unmatched. Valerius burst into the cavern, a living whirlwind of chitin and fury. His arrival galvanized the defenders. He directly engaged the scout sergeant, a young but highly skilled warrior, his integrated bone blades clashing against the scout's combat knife. Valerius's profound strength and preternatural speed were a match for the superhuman prowess of the Space Marine. The battle became a desperate swirling melee in the bioluminescent gloom. Spore-Kin warriors launched themselves against the Space Marines, sacrificing themselves to slow the advance. Bioacid ate through ceramite, but bolter rounds tore through organic armor with sickening finality. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, blood, and burning fungal matter. Then the heavy armor arrived, a predator tank, its sponson-mounted heavy bolters blazing, followed by a land raider redeemer, its flamestorm cannons unleashing torrents of superheated promethium. The Space Marines fell back slightly, allowing the armor to engage. The cavern became an inferno, the promethium turning the delicate fungal growths into blazing infernos, cooking the air, forcing the Spore-Kin to recoil. Valerius, witnessing the devastation, knew that even their resilience had its limits. The flamestorm cannons would purify the entire chamber, consuming every non-combatant, every child, every last vestige of hope. They could not hold. Not against this. In that moment of darkest despair, as the promethium inferno raged around them, Valerius made the only choice he had left. It was a gamble, a desperate last-ditch effort to buy time, to save what little remained of his people. He channeled his own immense bioenergy, drawing on the deepest symbionts within him, pushing his connection to Xylos to its absolute limit. His body shuddered, light emanating from every pore, every plate of chitin. The fungal growths around him pulsed violently, reacting to his unleashed power. With a guttural roar, a complex series of clicks and hums that reverberated through the very rock, Valerius issued a command that flowed through the communal network, a desperate plea and a terrifying order. He called upon the deepest, most primordial energies of Xylos, not to attack, but to defend. He was attempting to trigger a planet-wide, localized defensive response, a desperate, suicidal act that could tear Xylos apart. This was their darkest hour, and Valerius, the root commander, was prepared to sacrifice everything, even Xylos itself, for the chance of survival. Valerius's roar, a guttural symphony of clicks and hums, resonated not just through the communal chamber, but deep into the very heart of Xylos itself. It was a command, a plea, and a desperate act of will, sent along the planet's vast, interconnected bio-networks. His body glowed with an unnerving amber intensity, pulses of bioluminescent energy coursing through his chitinous form. The symbiotic organisms that made him the root commander reacted violently, drawing upon reservoirs of energy that threatened to tear him apart. The Space Marine scouts in the accompanying armor, momentarily halted by the sheer force of Valerius's desperate act, watched in horrified fascination. The air grew thick with ozone, and the ground trembled as if the planet itself was in agony. The flamestorm cannons of the Land Raider Redeemer ceased their inferno as its targeting systems overloaded, overwhelmed by a torrent of raw bioempathic feedback. Then Xylos responded, not with fire or seismic shockwaves, but with life. From the deepest primordial layers of the planet, a surge of bioenergy erupted. Within the communal chamber, the dense fibrous walls began to shift and grow with terrifying speed. Previously inert chitinous plates swelled and expanded, forming new, resilient barricades that absorbed the heat of the smoldering promethium. From cracks in the floor, Ancient fungal growths burst forth, their tendrils wrapping around the legs of the predator tank, attempting to engulf its tracks. More profoundly, the very air in the cavern began to change. A new strain of spores, unlike any encountered before, began to manifest. They were not corrosive nor toxic, but instead radiated a calming, almost soporific effect. They clung to the armor of the Imperial forces, infiltrating their air filters and even the subtle neuroregulators of the Space Marines. Minds accustomed to the rigid discipline of Imperial doctrine found themselves flooded with a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace, a primal empathy that clashed violently with their programmed hatred of the Xenos. The Space Marine scouts faltered, their movements becoming sluggish, their bolters lowering as a profound sense of confusion washed over them. Their combat instincts screamed defiance, but their augmented minds were suddenly awash with feelings of connection, of shared existence, of an ancient cosmic weariness. It was not a physical attack, but a psychic assault, broadcast through the planet's awakened biosentience. A desperate plea for recognition, for an end to the meaningless slaughter. Commander Valerius, pushing his own body beyond its limits, channeled this planet-wide bioempathic wave. He extended his awareness to the Space Marines, attempting to bridge the chasm of centuries and dogma, to communicate the struggle, the longing for survival, the terrible cost of their continued existence. Images flooded the minds of the Imperial warriors, centuries of isolation, the horror of the warp, storm, the desperate embrace of the Xenos symbionts, the unending fight for every scrap of life. They felt the burden of Valerius, the love for his twisted people, the agony of their rejection. It was a psychic scream of desperation, a direct plea from the core of Xylos, transmitted through its most integrated child. The Space Marines, paragons of anti-Xeno zeal, recoiled. Some clutched their helmets, groaning as their psychic defenses were battered by the unexpected onslaught. Others simply stood frozen, their bolters clattering to the floor, their eyes wide with incomprehension and a dawning, terrible realization. They were fighting not just a Xenos-tainted foe, but a desperate, broken fragment of humanity, crying out for its right to exist. This was not a victory in the conventional sense. The Spore-Kin were still outnumbered, their infrastructure crippled. Valerius himself was collapsing, his body ravaged by the immense bioenergy he had unleashed. But he had bought them time. The Imperial assault faltered, its impetus broken by the profound, unsettling psychic resonance of Xylos. The Space Marines, momentarily stunned and emotionally crippled by the planetary empathy, were incapable of continuing their attack. "Withdraw," a Space Marine sergeant finally roared, his voice hoarse, shaking off the lingering influence of the spores. "Fall back. This world, this foe, is tainted. Retreat to a safe distance." The Land Raider Redeemer reversed, its flamestorm cannons silent. The Predator rumbled backwards. The Space Marines, still shaken, reformed their lines and retreated from the communal chamber, their minds reeling from the impossible, forbidden empathy they had experienced. They had seen not just a monstrous Xenos hybrid, but the echoes of their own humanity, twisted and broken, but still undeniably there. The communal chamber was saved, its inhabitants spared from the purifying flames, but the cost was immense. Commander Valerius lay prone amidst the rapidly growing fungal growths, his body spasming, his bioluminescence fading. His skin was cracked, seeping vital fluids, his symbionts utterly depleted. He had unleashed the heart of Xylos, a force of raw, untamed bioempathy, and it had nearly consumed him. The Spore-Kin rushed to his side, their collective fear now replaced by a shared agony for their root commander. His sacrifice had saved them, but at what cost to him and to Xylos? The immediate threat was repelled, but the battle for Xylos was far from over. The Imperium would return, their resolve hardened by this perplexing encounter. But for a brief, terrifying moment, a lost world had screamed its existence into the void, and the Imperium had, for the first time, truly listened. The aftermath of Valerius's desperate act was a precarious lull in the storm of war. The Imperial forces had retreated from the communal chamber, stunned and disoriented by the unexpected bioempathic surge. Inquisitor Lord Vorlag, enraged by the unexpected resistance and the unsettling reports of his Space Marines' emotional confusion, ordered a tactical withdrawal to orbit, demanding a full psychological and biological analysis of the Xylosian event. The concept of an enemy that could wage war with empathy and primal connection was anathema, a heresy beyond his immediate comprehension. Deep within Xylos, the Spore-Kin tended to their root commander. Valerius lay in a biostasis chamber, surrounded by specialized fungal growths that slowly, painstakingly, began the process of healing and regeneration. His body, ravaged by the sheer bioenergy he had channeled, was slowly knitting itself back together, but the process was agonizingly slow. His consciousness, too, was in a fragile state, adrift between the raw, planetary empathy he had unleashed and the focused will of his individual self. He was alive, a testament to the resilience of his symbionts, but profoundly changed, perhaps forever. The collective consciousness of the Spore-Kin, shaken by the near death of their leader, was a blend of relief and profound exhaustion. They had saved their non-combatants. They had driven back the Imperium, but at a cost that was becoming unsustainable. Their population continued to dwindle, their bioproduction facilities were still crippled, and the strain on the planetary ecosystem was immense. Xylos itself, though defended, bore the scars of orbital bombardment and internal bioenergy surges. The reprieve, however, allowed the Spore-Kin to fully assess their situation. Their elders, including Mycelia and Root, convened an emergency session. The truth was stark. They could not win a war of attrition against the Imperium. Their temporary advantage, born of a desperate, unforeseen psychic weapon, would not last. The Imperium would adapt, would devise countermeasures, and would return with even greater, more destructive force. They had proven their ability to fight, but they had not proven their right to exist in the eyes of an unforgiving galaxy. "We cannot continue this way," Elder Root rumbled, his voice heavy with grim resignation. "We bleed for every meter of ground, and they have oceans of blood to spare. Valerius's sacrifice bought us time, but not victory." "Then what path remains?" Elder Mycelia questioned, her bioluminescent eyes dim with sorrow. "To surrender is to accept purification, eradication. To fight is to delay the inevitable." A young warrior, known as Tendril, one of the few who still bore a strong resemblance to baseline humanity, though his skin was mottled with fine, glowing vascularity, spoke with quiet conviction. "We showed them our heart. We showed them our spirit. Did they feel nothing?" "They felt confusion and revulsion," Mycelia replied, a mournful hum in her voice. "The Imperium is not built for empathy, young one. It is built for rigid faith and unyielding purity." It was a stalemate, a horrific impasse. The Imperium could not easily conquer Xylos without unacceptable losses, but the Spore-Kin could not defeat the Imperium without exhausting their very existence. The verdict, it seemed, was one of mutual grinding destruction. But then, a faint, rhythmic pulse began to emanate from Valerius's biostasis chamber, a subtle but insistent thrum that resonated through the command cavern. It was Valerius attempting to communicate, even in his injured state. The elders focused their bioempathic senses, allowing his fragmented thoughts to filter into their collective consciousness. His message was not of despair, but of a grim, desperate plan. He had felt the minds of the Space Marines, glimpsed their internal struggles, seen the horror that Xylos's empathy had wrought within them. He knew their weakness, not of courage or skill, but of ideological rigidity. They could not accept what they had felt, what they had seen. This was their undoing, but it was also their only path to a perverse form of understanding. Valerius proposed a final, audacious gambit. Not a battle for victory, but a battle for recognition. They would offer themselves not for surrender, but for integration. They would become an instrument of the Imperium, but on their own terms, leveraging their unique abilities, their symbiotic strength, to serve the Emperor as no other Imperial force could. It was a terrifying proposition, an offer to become a living, weaponized anomaly within the very heart of the Imperium. The elders debated, their clicks and hums filling the chamber. It was a monstrous gamble, an act of faith that bordered on heresy itself. To willingly enter the lion's den, to offer their abominable existence as a tool for the very force that sought to purge them. But the alternative was absolute annihilation. This was the true, unforgiving verdict: adapt or perish. And the Spore-Kin, having adapted for 5 centuries, would make one final terrifying adaptation. The Imperium would not accept their humanity, but perhaps it could be made to accept their utility. Valerius, though broken, had laid out a path that was not of reconciliation, but of forced coexistence, a monstrous compromise that might just save them, Even if it meant eternal damnation in the eyes of many, the war was not over. It was merely about to undergo a terrifying, unprecedented transformation. The final gambit of the Spore-Kin was audacious, suicidal in its intent, and ultimately, their salvation. Valerius, slowly recovering but still weakened, transmitted his proposal through the fragments of Imperial Vox channels his engineers managed to subvert. He offered not surrender, but an alliance, not subjugation, but integration as a unique, self-sustaining unit within the Imperium dedicated to xenocidal warfare. They would bring their unique symbiotic abilities, their unparalleled environmental adaptation, and their horrifying bioweapons to bear against the Emperor's foes in exchange for their right to exist, unpurged. Inquisitor Lord Vorlag, presented with this unprecedented offer, was initially apoplectic with rage. The very idea was anathema, a festering wound in the purity of the Imperium. But the reality of the Xylosian conflict weighed heavily on his mind. His forces were bogged down, suffering unacceptable casualties, and the cost of total extermination was escalating. Furthermore, the reports from the Space Marines, recounting their unsettling empathic experience, hinted at a power that, while abhorrent, could potentially be harnessed. The Adeptus Mechanicus, always pragmatic and hungry for new technologies, saw the potential. The Xylosians were a living, adaptive bioweapon system, self-repairing, self-reproducing, and perfectly integrated with their equipment. Their bioweapons were novel, efficient, and horrifyingly effective against conventional foes. To dissect and understand such a phenomenon could yield untold advancements, even if it meant tolerating the anomaly for a time. After protracted and acrimonious debate, a grim compromise was reached. The Spore-Kin of Xylos would not be purged, but they would never again be considered full citizens of the Imperium. They would be designated a bioadaptive auxiliary force, forever bound to the direct command of the Inquisition, used as a weapon against the most abhorrent Xenos threats and in the most toxic, uninhabitable war zones. They would serve the Emperor, but in eternal purgatory, their world remaining a quarantine zone, their presence within Imperial space strictly controlled and monitored. And so the Spore-Kin marched, not in triumph, but in grim acceptance. Their first deployment was to a nameless desert world, infested by a virulent, chittering Xenos insectoid species that conventional Imperial Guard regiments had failed to dislodge. The Spore-Kin, clad in their chitinous armor, moving as one with the harsh environment, utilized their bioempathic connection to the planet to track and ambush the Xenos. Their bioacid weapons melted chitin, their spore clouds choked respiration, and their collective silent communication allowed them to outmaneuver and annihilate the Xenos hordes with brutal efficiency. The mission was a resounding, if horrifying, success. The legacy of the Spore-Kin was forged in fire and shadow, a testament to the grim cruelty of the 41st millennium. They became the Imperium's living blight, its monstrous surgical instrument, sent to cleanse worlds where purity was already lost or where no other force could survive. They fought in forgotten sectors and toxic nebulae, on worlds where the very air was poison. They were seen as a necessary evil, a tool that was itself a heresy, but too effective to discard. Commander Valerius, known now as the root commander of the Xylosian bio-auxiliaries, led his people with grim determination. His body bore the permanent scars of his sacrifice, his connection to Xylos deeper than ever, making him almost one with the planetary life. He watched his people fight, their forms ever so subtly shifting and adapting with each new battlefield, each new Xenos foe they encountered. They were a perpetual reminder of the Imperium's unforgiving nature and of humanity's terrifying capacity for survival, even at the cost of its very soul. They never truly reintegrated. Their world, Xylos, remained quarantined, a verdant, pulsating nightmare from which they were selectively deployed. Their interactions with other Imperial forces were tense, often met with fear and revulsion. They remained outsiders, a grim, silent force, their purpose forever entwined with the annihilation of the Emperor's enemies, their existence a living contradiction. The Spore-Kin, the lost guard of Xylos, became an eternal cautionary tale, a whisper in the dark corners of the Imperium. The cost of isolation, the horror of adaptation, and the unyielding, tragic price of survival in a galaxy that had no room for deviation. They had survived, but at what true cost? Their humanity was gone, replaced by something alien and terrible. their service an eternal penance for the crime of enduring. Their legacy was one of grim, silent warfare, an eternal march towards a future where hope was a luxury and survival, however grotesque, was the only true victory.